Humanity's darkest hour. The Galactic Empire had never faced an enemy as ruthless as the Tsar Empire. Once known for their technological prowess and peaceful advances, the Tsar had turned into merciless exterminators. Their latest attack on Nova Prime, a distant human colony, was the deadliest yet. In the blink of an eye, the gleaming cities of Nova Prime were reduced to smoldering ruins. But it wasn't the destruction of infrastructure that sent shockwaves through the galaxy. It was the massacre of 800,000 children. Commander Alina Rees stood before a holographic display at Earth's Central Command, her fists clenched tightly. The sight of Nova Prime's once vibrant metropolises now reduced to craters filled her with cold rage. The Tsar hadn't just attacked. They had deliberately targeted children. Daycares, schools, and hospitals had been obliterated without warning or mercy. The revelation. Admiral Jackson Chen's voice was barely audible. They specifically targeted the young. This is more than an attack, it's genocide. His words echoed through the room, filled with military leaders and politicians who struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the atrocity. Alina's mind raced. Her sister and young niece had been on Nova Prime. The weight of personal loss mixed with a growing sense of duty. She wasn't just a soldier now, she was a protector of humanity's future. President Lydia Ortiz, pale and shaken, demanded answers. Why? Why target our children? Have we heard anything from the Tsar? The answer came from a young intelligence officer. No formal communication, Madame President, but we've intercepted some of their transmissions. They view us as a threat to their dominion. The attack was to cull the human infestation before it could spread. Humanity's response. Alina's rage boiled over. Infestation. They murdered children to send a message. Admiral Chen, with a hand on her shoulder, spoke calmly but with fiery determination. We've been hearing about their expansion for centuries. They don't conquer, they exterminate. Other species have tried to resist, but none succeeded. Voices erupted from around the room, some calling for immediate retaliation, others arguing for alliances. But Alina knew humanity couldn't afford hesitation. Her voice cut through the chaos, resolute and clear. We fight, not just for revenge, but for survival. Admiral Chen nodded. But we can't do it conventionally. We need to be smarter, hit them in ways they won't expect. We need to adapt. Operation Nemesis. Thus, Operation Nemesis was born. A multi-pronged assault combining guerrilla warfare, technological innovation, and diplomatic outreach to other species oppressed by the Tsar Empire. Alina felt a flicker of hope. It was risky, audacious, and perhaps desperate, but it played to humanity's strengths: ingenuity, resilience, and adaptability. President Ortiz stood, her voice firm. This isn't just a war. It's a fight for the survival of our species. If we commit to this, there's no turning back. Alina straightened. I volunteer to lead the first strike team. The Tsar need to learn that when you spill the blood of our children, you've sealed your own fate. Preparations for war. Over the next 6 months, humanity mobilized at an unprecedented pace. Factories that once produced consumer goods now churned out weapons. Scientists worked around the clock to reverse engineer Tsar technology, developing new weapons and systems that would allow human forces to compete with a more advanced alien empire. Alina found herself at the heart of these preparations. As the leader of the first strike team, she trained with the best soldiers humanity had to offer. They were equipped with cutting-edge technology, such as the XN-12 Phantom, a rifle capable of bypassing Tsar energy shields and delivering devastating payloads. We're not here to fight a conventional war, Alina told her troops during a final briefing. We're here to rewrite the rules. The first strike. When the call came that a Tsar forward operating base had been located near the ruins of Nova Prime, the team knew it was time. They deployed aboard the UES Nemesis, humanity's most advanced stealth ship. The journey was tense, the weight of their mission palpable. Failure was not an option. The Tsar base was a sprawling, organic-looking structure that pulsed with an eerie inner light. Cloaking systems activated, and Alina's team moved with precision, planting charges and gathering intelligence as they navigated the alien corridors. But then something went wrong. A massive Tsar warrior, larger and more heavily armored than any they had seen, seemed to sense their presence despite their cloaking fields. The alarm was raised. Change of plans. Alina barked. We bring this whole place down. Now, the ensuing battle was chaotic and fierce. Alina's team fought with every ounce of strength, their weapons proving their worth as Tsar warriors fell before them. But the cost was high, and as they made their final push to the extraction point, Alina found herself face to face with one of the Tsar's elite commanders. The face of the enemy. The Tsar commander towered over her, its mandibles clicking in a menacing rhythm. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Alina raised her rifle, determination hardening her gaze. This was no longer just a mission, it was personal. For her niece, for the future. As the battle raged on, the seeds of humanity's survival were sown. This was only the beginning, the battle for survival. The aftermath of the first strikes sent ripples through the Tsar Empire. The destruction of their forward operating base near the ruins of Nova Prime was a small but significant victory for humanity. It was a message that the Tsar couldn't ignore. Humanity would not go quietly into the void. But Alina Rees knew that this victory was only the beginning. The real war was just starting. Back on Earth, preparations for the next phase of Operation Nemesis were already underway. The intelligence gathered from the base provided invaluable insight into the Tsar's military operations, and now humanity had a rare opportunity to strike a decisive blow. But this time, they couldn't rely on stealth alone. The Tsar would be ready. New allies, new hope. As Alina stood in the war room, surrounded by holographic projections of Tsar fleet movements and human tactical options, Admiral Chen entered with news that changed the game. "We've made contact with the Wrath," he said, his voice carrying both urgency and excitement. The Wrath were a mysterious race of reptilian warriors who had long resisted Tsar expansion. Little was known about them, but their reputation as fierce fighters was well established. If they could be convinced to join the fight, it would tip the balance in humanity's favor. Alina's brow furrowed. Do we trust them? Chen shrugged. We don't have a choice. The Wrath have suffered under the Tsar for centuries. They want revenge just as much as we do. A diplomatic team, led by President Lydia Ortiz herself, was dispatched to the Wrath homeworld. Alina was tasked with preparing her forces for the next major offensive, one that would strike deep into the heart of Tsar-controlled space. The stakes had never been higher. The calm before the storm. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Alina's elite strike team trained relentlessly, mastering the new weapons and strategies that would be essential for their survival. The scientists working on Project Prometheus had developed new enhancements, including portable shield generators and advanced hacking tools that would allow them to disable Tsar technology in the field. Despite the focus on war, a sense of camaraderie grew among the soldiers. They were no longer just fighting for survival, they were fighting for each other, for the families they had lost, and for the future they were determined to secure. Na, however, found herself increasingly isolated. The weight of leadership, combined with her personal grief, was beginning to take its toll. She spent long hours in the training room, pushing her body to its limits in an attempt to quiet the storm of emotions that raged within her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the children lost on Nova Prime, her niece among them. She had to keep moving, keep fighting, or the sorrow would consume her. The Wrath Alliance. At last, the diplomatic mission to the Wrath returned with good news. The Wrath had agreed to an alliance, on one condition: they would lead the assault on the Tsar homeworld. It was a bold, almost reckless plan, but the Wrath believed that a direct strike was the only way to cripple the Tsar once and for all. President Ortiz and the Earth military leadership were divided. Some argued that humanity was not yet ready for such a large-scale attack. that they needed more time to build up their forces and develop new technology. But Alina knew that time was a luxury they couldn't afford. The Tsar would retaliate soon, and when they did, it would be with overwhelming force. Alina stood before the gathered leaders and made her case. We strike now, with everything we've got. The Wrath are right. If we take out the Tsar leadership, we can destabilize their entire empire. This is our best chance. Admiral Chen, standing beside her, nodded in agreement. Commander Rees is right. Waiting will only give the Tsar more time to strengthen their defenses. We need to act while they're still reeling from the loss of their forward base. After hours of debate, the decision was made. The alliance would move forward, and the assault on the Tsar homeworld was scheduled to begin in just 2 weeks. Into the heart of darkness, the combined human and Wrath fleet gathered at a secret staging point near the edge of Tsar-controlled space. The Wrath warships were unlike anything humanity had ever seen, sleek, predatory vessels bristling with weaponry. They moved with a silent grace that belied their destructive power. Alina's team boarded the UES Nemesis once again, this time knowing that they were heading into the most dangerous mission yet. The Tsar homeworld was heavily fortified, protected by layers of defenses that would make any direct assault a suicide mission. But the Wrath had a plan. As the fleet prepared to jump into hyperspace, Alina gathered her team for a final briefing. "This is it," she said, her voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for the future of every human being, for every child that will be born on Earth and the colonies. Failure is not an option." Her soldiers, the best of the best, nodded in silent agreement. They had trained for this moment. They were ready. The battle begins. The assault on the Tsar homeworld began with a massive bombardment from the combined human and Wrath fleets. The skies over the alien planet lit up with explosions as the Tsar defenses struggled to respond to the sudden onslaught. But the real battle was fought on the ground. Alina's team was one of several strike forces tasked with infiltrating key Tsar installations. Their mission: disable the planetary defense grid and create an opening for the Wrath warships to deliver the final blow. The Tsar homeworld was unlike any place Alina had ever seen. The landscape was a strange mix of organic structures and harsh alien technology. The air was thick with tension as her team moved through the shadows, using their cloaking devices to remain undetected. But the Tsar were not unprepared. As they neared their target, the alarm was raised. Alina's pulse quickened. "Move, move," she shouted as her team dashed forward, weapons blazing. The Tsar warriors, larger and more imposing than the ones they had faced before, charged toward them with terrifying speed. The battle was brutal and chaotic. The Tsar fought with a ferocity that seemed almost primal, their sheer strength overwhelming. But Alina's team had something the Tsar didn't: determination. They fought not just for themselves, but for the survival of their entire species. A turning point. In the heart of the Tsar Command Center, Alina faced off against the Tsar warlord. Towering over her, its mandibles clicking menacingly, the creature exuded a sense of power and domination. But Alina stood her ground. This was the enemy who had ordered the massacre of 800,000 children. She wouldn't back down. The fight was swift and deadly. Alina's agility and quick thinking gave her the edge, and with a final decisive strike, the Tsar warlord fell. The defense grid was down. "Mission accomplished," Alina said, her voice heavy with exhaustion but filled with triumph. As the Wrath warships descended, delivering the final blow to the Tsar's planetary stronghold, Alina knew that this battle had been a turning point. The war was far from over, but for the first time since the massacre on Nova Prime, humanity had hope. A fragile victory. The ruins of the Tsar homeworld smoldered in the aftermath of the human and Wrath assault. While the victory had been decisive, Alina Rees knew it was anything but final. The Tsar had been wounded, not defeated, and a wounded enemy could be more dangerous than ever. The mood aboard the UES Nemesis was a mix of exhaustion and elation. For many, This was their first taste of true victory against the Tsar, and they celebrated with cautious optimism. But Alina remained on edge. The destruction of the Tsar's command center had disrupted their leadership, but reports from the front lines indicated that Tsar forces across the galaxy were rallying, consolidating power under new warlords. The war was far from over. Admiral Chen's voice broke through her thoughts. "We need to keep moving," he said, his tone grim. "They won't take this lightly. Their retaliation will be swift." Alina nodded. "We fought ourselves some time, but not much. What's the next move?" Chen pulled up a holographic map, displaying the known Tsar-controlled systems. "There's a key supply line here, near the Brez Nebula. If we can cut it off, we'll cripple their ability to regroup." Alina studied the map. It was a dangerous move, but necessary. "I'll prepare my team." The weight of command. As the days passed, Alina found herself grappling with the weight of her leadership. The loss of her niece still haunted her, but now it was compounded by the faces of the soldiers who had died under her command. She had never asked for this role, but circumstances had forced her into it. Despite the camaraderie that had developed among her team, there were moments when the loneliness of command felt overwhelming. She confided in no one, choosing instead to throw herself into her work. She trained harder, slept less, and pushed her body to its limits. It was during one of these late-night training sessions that Alina received an unexpected visitor. President Lydia Ortiz, fresh from negotiations with the Wrath, walked into the training room, her expression unreadable. "Alina," Ortiz said, her voice soft but commanding, "you need to take care of yourself." Alina wiped the sweat from her brow and straightened. "I'm fine, Madam President." Ortiz shook her head. "You're not. You've been carrying the weight of this war on your shoulders, but you're not alone. You need to trust the people around you." The weight of command. As the days passed, Alina found herself grappling with the weight of her leadership. The loss of her niece still haunted her, but now it was compounded by the faces of the soldiers who had died under her command. She had never asked for this role, but circumstances had forced her into it. Despite the camaraderie that had developed among her team, there were moments when the loneliness of command felt overwhelming. She confided in no one, choosing instead to throw herself into her work. She trained harder, slept less, and pushed her body to its limits. It was during one of these late-night training sessions that Alina received an unexpected visitor. President Lydia Ortiz, fresh from negotiations with the Wrath, walked into the training room, her expression unreadable. "Alina," Ortiz said, her voice soft but commanding, "you need to take care of yourself." Alina wiped the sweat from her brow and straightened. "I'm fine, Madam President." Ortiz shook her head. "You're not. You've been carrying the weight of this war on your shoulders, but you're not alone. You need to trust the people around you." Alina opened her mouth to argue but stopped. Ortiz was right. She had been so focused on keeping everyone else safe that she had neglected her own well-being. But the thought of letting anyone else in, of appearing vulnerable, was terrifying. "I'll try," Alina said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. An unexpected betrayal. The mission to the Brez Nebula was supposed to be a simple one: cut off the Tsar supply line, cripple their ability to launch a counterattack, and return to Earth. But nothing about this war had been simple. As the UES Nemesis and the Wrath fleet prepared to strike, a distress signal came in from a nearby human colony. The message was fragmented, filled with static, but the words "Tsar attack" were unmistakable. Alina's heart sank. This was a diversion. The Tsar were trying to draw them away from their true objective. She turned to Admiral Chen, who was already assessing the situation. "They're trying to split us up," Alina said, her voice tight with frustration. Chen nodded. "We can't afford to be divided, but if we ignore the colony, they'll be slaughtered," Alina finished, her mind racing. "We need to send a team to defend the colony, but the supply line is our priority." The decision weighed heavily on Alina, but ultimately she knew what had to be done. "I'll take my team to the colony. You and the Wrath handle the supply line. Chen frowned, but didn't argue. Be careful, if this is a trap. I know, Elena said, her voice steely, but we can't let those people die. The trap springs. Elena's team arrived at the colony to find it already under siege. Tsar warships hovered menacingly in the sky, and the ground forces were overwhelming the colony's defenses. Civilians were fleeing in every direction, and the streets were filled with the sounds of battle and panic. Without hesitation, Elena led her team into the fray. The Tsar forces were brutal, but Elena's soldiers fought with a ferocity born of desperation. They had to hold the line, had to give the civilians a chance to escape. But as the battle raged on, Elena realized something was wrong. The Tsar were fighting with reckless abandon, throwing wave after wave of soldiers at her team with little regard for their own losses. It didn't make sense, unless the real attack wasn't here. Elena, we've got movement in the upper atmosphere, one of her soldiers shouted over the comms. Elena's blood ran cold. The Tsar had lured them into a trap. She quickly switched frequencies, trying to reach Admiral Chen, but all she got was static. They're jamming us, she muttered. We need to fall back. This isn't the main attack. As Elena's team regrouped, the realization hit her like a physical blow. The Tsar had played them perfectly. The attack on the colony was a distraction, and now the UES Nemesis and the Wrath fleet were in danger of being overwhelmed. We need to get back to the ship, Elena said, her voice laced with urgency. Now. A desperate gamble. By the time Elena and her team returned to the Nemesis, the situation was dire. The Tsar had launched a massive counteroffensive, hitting the human and Wrath forces with everything they had. The battle for the supply line had turned into a full-scale war. Admiral Chen's voice crackled over the comms. We're taking heavy losses. The Wrath are barely holding the line. If we don't retreat soon, we'll be wiped out. Elena's mind raced. If they retreated now, the Tsar would regain control of the supply line, and everything they had fought for would be lost. But staying meant certain death. Admiral, we can't retreat, Elena said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. If we give up the supply line, the Tsar will rebuild. We need to hit them where it hurts. Chen hesitated. What are you suggesting? Elena looked at the holographic map, her eyes locking on a point deep within Tsar-controlled space. We strike at their shipyards. If we destroy their ability to build new ships, they won't be able to recover. It's a suicide mission, Chen said bluntly. Elena nodded. Maybe, but it's our best shot. The final push. The decision was made. Elena's team, along with a small contingent of Wrath fighters, would launch a daring assault on the Tsar shipyards. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy, but it was their only chance to turn the tide of the war. As the Nemesis jumped into hyperspace, Elena took a moment to steady herself. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on her, but there was no room for doubt. This was the final push. If they succeeded, humanity might just have a chance. If they failed, well, she wouldn't allow herself to think about that. Ready? She asked her team, her voice strong and unwavering. Her soldiers nodded, determination etched on their faces. Let's end this. Into the heart of the storm, the UES Nemesis dropped out of hyperspace, emerging into a scene of chaos. The Tsar shipyards loomed ahead, massive, industrial complexes floating in the darkness, surrounded by countless warships in various stages of construction. Tsar defense platforms dotted the surrounding space, their weapons already locking onto the human and Wrath forces. Elena Rees stood on the bridge, her eyes fixed on the massive shipyards. This was it, the heart of the Tsar war machine. Destroying these shipyards would cripple their ability to launch new fleets and give humanity a fighting chance. But the odds were stacked against them. Admiral Chen, Elena said, her voice calm but urgent, we need to get in close and disable their main power grid. If we can knock that out, their defenses will be vulnerable. Chen nodded, his face tense but focused. Understood. I'll take the Nemesis in, But you and your team will need to disable the grid from the ground. We can't risk getting too close to those defense platforms." Elena turned to her team, who were readying themselves for the ground assault. The mission was clear: infiltrate the shipyards, disable the power grid, and get out before the Tsar reinforcements arrived. But it wouldn't be easy. The shipyards were heavily fortified, and the Tsar would be on high alert. As the Nemesis approached the shipyards, Elena felt a surge of adrenaline. She had led her team through impossible situations before, but this felt different. This was a do-or-die moment, not just for them but for the entire war effort. "Let's move," Elena said, her voice cutting through the tension. Ground infiltration. Elena's team landed on the surface of the shipyards amidst a storm of anti-air fire. Tsar patrols swarmed the area, and the sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. The air was thick with tension as they moved swiftly, avoiding detection and neutralizing guards as they made their way to the power grid. The shipyards were a labyrinth of metal corridors and towering machinery. Every step felt like a race against time, as the Tsar fleet above was mobilizing to engage the Nemesis and the Wrath fighters. But Elena's team was focused, moving with precision and discipline. They reached the power grid, a massive control room deep within the complex. The room was heavily guarded, and the moment Elena's team entered, the Tsar forces opened fire. "Take cover," Elena shouted, returning fire as her team spread out, using the machinery for cover. The room erupted into chaos as plasma blasts filled the air. The Tsar were relentless, but Elena's team held their ground, pushing forward with a fierce determination. Amidst the battle, Elena spotted the control panel for the power grid, a large terminal near the back of the room. She signaled to her second-in-command, Lieutenant Kummel, who nodded and moved towards it, covering his approach with precise shots. Elena fought to keep the Tsar forces at bay as Kummel worked to disable the grid. Come on," Kummel muttered as he bypassed the security protocols. The power grid was heavily encrypted, but Kummel was a genius when it came to tech. Finally, the terminal beeped and the lights flickered. "We're in," Kummel shouted. Elena gave the order to plant explosives on the main reactor. If the terminal alone couldn't disable the grid, the explosives would finish the job. Time was running out, and they needed to get out before the entire structure went up in flames. The turning point. As the explosives were set and the countdown began, Elena's team raced back towards their extraction point. But the Tsar weren't giving up easily. Reinforcements poured into the shipyards, and the sounds of battle grew louder and more desperate. The Wrath fleet above was holding the line, but barely. The Nemesis was taking heavy fire, its shields flickering under the relentless barrage from the Tsar warships. Admiral Chen's voice crackled over the comms, his tone grim. "Reeves, we're running out of time. If you don't get those defenses down soon, we'll be forced to retreat." Elena's heart pounded as she sprinted through the corridors. The countdown on her wrist display showed only minutes remaining before the explosives detonated. The mission had to succeed. There was no other option. "We're almost there," Elena responded, her breath ragged. "Hold the line." As her team reached the extraction point, the shipyards shook with the force of the explosions. The main reactor had been hit, and the power grid was going offline. Elena watched as the Tsar defense platforms flickered, their energy fields collapsing. For the first time in the battle, they had an opening. "Now, Admiral, hit them with everything you've got." The Wrath fighters and the Nemesis unleashed a devastating barrage of firepower, targeting the now vulnerable shipyards. Explosions rippled across the massive structures as the human and Wrath forces pressed the attack. The Tsar fleet, caught off guard by the sudden loss of their defenses, began to falter. But Elena knew it wasn't over yet. They still needed to get out. "Commander," with picking up Tsar reinforcements inbound. One of her soldiers warned, pointing at the sky where new Tsar warships were emerging from hyperspace. "Get to the shuttle," Elena ordered, her voice firm. "We need to leave now." The escape. The team boarded their shuttle as the Tsar reinforcements closed in. The shipyards were collapsing in a cascade of explosions, but the remaining Tsar forces were regrouping, and their warships were bearing down on the Nemesis. As the shuttle launched into the air, Alina watched the battle unfold. The Wrath fleet was retreating, their ships damaged but still operational. The Nemesis was pulling back as well, its engines flaring as it tried to escape the range of the Tsar warships. "Alina, we've got incoming fire," Kamal shouted from the cockpit. Alina braced herself as the shuttle weaved through a hail of plasma fire. The Tsar warships were relentless, but the shuttle's pilot, Lieutenant Kira Voss, was skilled, dodging and weaving with incredible precision. "We're not out of this yet," Voss muttered, her hands steady on the controls. Just as it seemed like they might make it, a Tsar fighter broke through their defensive screen, its weapons locked on the shuttle. The plasma cannons fired, and the shuttle shook violently as alarms blared. "We've been hit," Voss shouted, struggling to keep the shuttle steady. Alina's heart pounded as she grabbed the nearest handhold. The shuttle's hull was breached, and they were losing altitude fast. She could see the Tsar warships closing in, ready to finish them off. But then, out of nowhere, a Wrath warship swooped in, blasting the Tsar fighter out of the sky. The shuttle stabilized, and Alina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We're clear," Voss said, relief evident in her voice. Alina leaned back in her seat, exhaustion washing over her. The mission had been a success, but it had come at a high cost. The shipyards were destroyed, and the Tsar fleet had been dealt a crippling blow, but the war was far from over. As the shuttle made its way back to the Nemesis, Alina knew that the hardest battles were still to come. The Tsar counteroffensive. The UES Nemesis limped away from the battle, the destruction of the Tsar shipyards a bitter victory. Admiral Chen stood on the bridge, watching the debris of the once mighty Tsar industrial complex drift through space. But there was no time to celebrate. The Tsar had already begun to regroup, and the warnings from intelligence were ominous. Their retaliation would be swift and brutal. Alina Reeves, bruised and exhausted, stepped onto the bridge. She had barely slept since their last mission, but there was no rest for her or her team. The destruction of the shipyards had crippled the Tsar war machine temporarily, but the looming threat of a counterattack weighed heavily on everyone's minds. "We've got incoming transmissions from the Wrath High Command," Admiral Chen said, his voice low. "They've intercepted Tsar communications. They're preparing for a massive counteroffensive." Elena felt a cold chill run down her spine. How soon? "Days, maybe less," Chen replied grimly. "They're rallying all their remaining forces. It's going to be an all-out assault." The war was about to enter its most dangerous phase. The Tsar, wounded but not broken, were coming back with everything they had left. Humanity and the Wrath would have to withstand the full might of the Tsar Empire or face total annihilation. A fragile alliance. In the Wrath capital, tensions were running high. The alliance between humanity and the Wrath had always been tenuous, and the recent victory had done little to ease the friction between the two species. Now, with the Tsar counteroffensive looming, those tensions were boiling over. Alina and her team arrived at the Wrath Command Center, where human and Wrath leaders were locked in a heated debate. "We need to strike now, before the Tsar can regroup," General Stavros, one of the human military leaders, shouted. "We cannot afford to waste our forces on another reckless attack," Wrath High Commander Yethan retorted. "Our fleets are already stretched thin. If we rush into battle, we risk losing everything." Alina stood at the back of the room, watching the argument unfold. It was the same old story. Humans pushing for immediate action, the Wrath urging caution. Neither side could agree on the best course of action, and time was running out. Finally, Alina stepped forward. "We can't afford to be divided right now. The Tsar are coming, and we need to be ready. Whether we strike first or wait for their attack, we have to work together." Her words seemed to cut through the tension, and the room fell silent. General Stavros sighed, his expression softening. She's right. We need a unified strategy. High Commander Yethen nodded slowly. Agreed, but we must be smart about this. The Tsar will not make the same mistakes twice. After hours of debate, the decision was made. They would prepare for a defensive stand, fortifying key positions while keeping their fleets mobile. If the Tsar struck first, they would be ready to counterattack. It was a risky strategy, but it was their best shot at survival. The calm before the storm. Back aboard the Nemesis, the mood was somber. The crew worked tirelessly to repair the ship's damage, but everyone knew that the next battle could be their last. The Tsar were preparing for an all-out assault, and there was no guarantee that humanity or the Wrath would survive it. Alina sat in her quarters, going over battle plans with her team. They had faced impossible odds before, but this felt different. The Tsar had been pushed into a corner, and now they were coming back with everything they had. There was a sense of finality in the air. Lieutenant Kummel, always the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. Hey, we've beaten them once, right? We'll do it again. Alina managed a small smile. Yeah, we will. But deep down, she knew the stakes had never been higher. As the final preparations were made, Alina took a moment to herself. She thought about the war, about the countless lives lost on both sides. The Tsar were ruthless, yes, but they were also fighting for their survival, just like humanity. It was a sobering thought. She wondered briefly if there could ever be peace between their species. But as the countdown to the Tsar counteroffensive ticked closer, she knew that peace was a distant dream. For now, there was only the fight. The Tsar strike back. The Tsar fleet arrived sooner than expected, emerging from hyperspace like a tidal wave of destruction. Thousands of warships, larger and more powerful than anything humanity or the Wrath had ever seen, filled the void of space. Their arrival was a grim reminder of just how vast the Tsar Empire truly was. Admiral Chen stood on the bridge of the Nemesis, his face pale as he watched the Tsar fleet bear down on their position. "This is it," he muttered. "All hands, prepare for battle." Alina and her team were already in position, ready to deploy at a moment's notice. The Nemesis shook as the first volleys of plasma fire rained down on them. The battle had begun. The human and Wrath fleets fought with everything they had, but the Tsar were relentless. Their ships were faster, their weapons more advanced, and their tactics brutal. For every Tsar ship destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. Alina's shuttle launched into the fray, weaving through the chaos as they headed for the Tsar command ship. The plan was simple: cut off the head, and the body would fall. If they could disable the Tsar flagship, they might just have a chance to turn the tide. But as they approached the massive Tsar warship, Alina realized just how dangerous the mission was. The command ship was surrounded by heavy defenses, and the Tsar weren't going to let them get close without a fight. "Stay sharp," Alina shouted as they dodged incoming fire. "We've only got one shot at this." The shuttle sped towards the command ship, its engines roaring as they broke through the defensive screen. Alina's heart raced as they prepared to board the enemy vessel. This was it, the final gambit. A desperate gamble. Inside the Tsar command ship, Alina and her team fought their way through a maze of corridors, encountering heavy resistance at every turn. The Tsar soldiers were fierce, but Alina's team was faster, more precise. They pressed forward, knowing that the fate of the entire war rested on their shoulders. The battle's end. With the Tsar command ship disabled, the human and Wrath fleets launched the final coordinated attack. The Tsar forces, now leaderless and disorganized, began to crumble under the pressure. One by one, their warships were destroyed, and the battle turned in favor of the alliance. But the cost had been high. The Nemesis was heavily damaged, and many brave soldiers had lost their lives. As the smoke cleared and the last of the Tsar ships retreated, Alina stood on the bridge, staring at the wreckage. They had won, but at what cost? Next part, In Part 6, the aftermath of the battle reveals new tensions between humanity and the Wrath, as both sides struggle to rebuild in the wake of the Tsar counteroffensive. As old wounds resurface and new threats emerge, Elena and her team must navigate the political fallout while preparing for the final confrontation with the Tsar Empire. After the storm, the once mighty Tsar fleet was in ruins. Debris from their shattered ships floated in the void, a testament to the price paid for survival. The battle had ended, but the war had not. Humanity and the Wrath had scored a decisive victory, but the wounds left by the Tsar counteroffensive ran deep. Aboard the UES Nemesis, Elena Rees surveyed the damage. Fires still smoldered in the lower decks, and medical teams were stretched thin, attending to the wounded. The ship had barely survived, but it had held the line. Yet Elena knew that the scars of this battle went far beyond the physical damage to the fleet. The crew was exhausted, morale was low, and the alliance with the Wrath, already fragile, was beginning to fray. The victory had come at a heavy cost, and both sides were questioning whether they had the strength to continue the fight. The cost of victory. In the aftermath of the battle, Admiral Chen convened a war council aboard the Nemesis. Representatives from both humanity and the Wrath were present, but the mood was tense. Everyone knew that the Tsar had not been completely defeated. They had only been driven back, and their remnants were regrouping somewhere in the galaxy. "We lost over half our fleet in that engagement," General Stavros said grimly, pacing back and forth. "If the Tsar come at us again, I don't know if we can hold them off." Wrath High Commander Yethan crossed his arms, his eyes narrowed in thought. "The Tsar are wounded, but not broken. They will return, and we must be ready. But our alliance is weakened. Our people grow weary of this war, and trust between our forces is thin." Elena listened quietly from her place at the back of the room. She knew that Yethan was right. The Wrath and humans had fought side by side, but their differences were beginning to surface. Distrust and resentment had been simmering beneath the surface for months, and now, with the war entering its most critical phase, those tensions threatened to boil over. "We can't afford to be divided," Elena finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "The Tsar are still out there, and if we fall apart now, they'll finish what they started. We have to stay united." Admiral Chen nodded. "Elena's right. We need to rebuild, regroup, and strengthen our alliance. Only then can we face the final threat from the Tsar." But even as the leaders discussed strategies for rebuilding their forces, the cracks in the alliance grew wider. Both humanity and the Wrath had suffered heavy losses, and both sides were beginning to question whether the other could be trusted to hold up their end of the war. New fissures, old wounds. As the War Council broke up, Elena found herself alone in the corridors of the Nemesis. She was deep in thought, wondering how much longer the alliance would last. The Wrath had been invaluable allies in the fight against the Tsar, but their cautious approach to warfare often clashed with humanity's more aggressive tactics. And now, with both sides weakened, those differences were becoming harder to ignore. Lieutenant Kumel caught up to her as she walked. "Rough meeting her." Elena sighed. "Yeah, we're barely holding it together. I don't know how much longer this alliance is going to last." Kumel shrugged. "We've been through worse. We'll figure it out. We always do." But Elena wasn't so sure. The tension between the Wrath and humanity had been building for too long, and now, with the Tsar still a looming threat, she wasn't sure if they could come together when it mattered most. Seeds of dissent. In the weeks following the battle, both human and Wrath forces began the long process of rebuilding. Shipyards worked around the clock to repair damaged vessels, and recruitment efforts intensified as both species prepared for the final push against the Tsar. But the cracks in the alliance continued to grow. On the Wrath homeworld, anti-human sentiments were beginning to spread. Many Wrath citizens blamed humanity for the heavy losses their people had suffered in the war, and there were whispers of withdrawing from the alliance entirely. Meanwhile, on Earth, similar sentiments were brewing. Many humans felt that the Wrath were holding them back, that their cautious approach to warfare was costing lives. Protests erupted in major cities, with citizens demanding that humanity either take the fight to the Tsar on its own or force the Wrath to commit more fully to the war effort. Alina and her team found themselves caught in the middle of this growing divide. They had fought alongside the Wrath for months, but now they were beginning to question whether the alliance could survive the coming storm. One evening, while stationed on a Wrath outpost, Alina met with Wrath Captain Thara, a soldier she'd have fought beside during the Tsar counteroffensive. Thara had always been a strong supporter of the alliance, but even she was beginning to have doubts. "My people are growing restless, Alina," Thara said quietly as they stood overlooking the Wrath city below. "They no longer see the humans as allies. They see you as a burden, a people who fight recklessly and without regard for the cost." Alina frowned. "We fought side by side since the beginning. We've sacrificed just as much as the Wrath." "I know that," Thara replied, "but the war has changed us all, and now, I'm not sure if our people can see past their differences." Alina didn't know what to say. She understood Thara's concerns, but she also knew that without the Wrath, humanity stood little chance against the Tsar. The alliance had to hold. It was their only hope. The final threat. As the divide between the humans and Wrath grew wider, new intelligence reports began to surface. The Tsar, though severely weakened, were not defeated. They had retreated to the farthest reaches of their empire, regrouping and consolidating their remaining forces. But they weren't just planning another attack. They were building something. A new weapon, powerful enough to wipe out entire planets. The reports were vague, but the threat was clear. If the Tsar completed this superweapon, neither humanity nor the Wrath would be able to stop them. Admiral Chen called another emergency meeting aboard the Nemesis. The mood was grim as the details of the Tsar's plans were revealed. "We have to strike now," General Stavros said, his voice firm. "If we wait, the Tsar will complete their weapon, and it'll be the end of us." High Commander Yethan frowned. "Our forces are still recovering. If we launch another attack now, we risk everything. We must gather more information before we act." The debate raged on, but Alina knew that time was running out. The Tsar were preparing for their final strike, and if humanity and the Wrath didn't come together soon, they would all be destroyed. A last chance for unity. Alina's thoughts were interrupted by a message from Captain Thara. The Wrath captain had uncovered something, evidence of a secret Tsar installation deep in uncharted space. It was a long shot, but if Alina and her team could infiltrate the installation, they might be able to sabotage the Tsar's superweapon before it was completed. It was a dangerous mission, one that would require both human and Wrath forces working together, but it might be their last chance to stop the Tsar. Alina knew what had to be done. She would lead the mission, and she would do whatever it took to bring the alliance back together. The fate of both species depended on it. Next part. In Part 7, Alina and her team embark on a perilous mission to infiltrate the Tsar's secret installation and destroy their superweapon. With tensions between the humans and Wrath at a breaking point, the fate of the galaxy rests on their shoulders. Can they stop the Tsar before it's too late, or will their division spell doom for them all? The final battle. Tsar soldiers poured into the chamber, weapons blazing. The strike team returned fire, using the sparse cover of the machinery around them. Alina took point, her pulse rifle cutting through the enemy ranks. Thara fought beside her, leading the Wrath soldiers with the same ferocity that had made her a legend among her people. "Get to the core," Alina shouted over the comms. "We need to take it out, or this is all for nothing." But the Tsar were relentless. Their forces surged into the chamber, overwhelming the strike team's position. Casualties began to mount. Kamal was hit in the leg, but continued fighting, his resolve unshaken. In the chaos, Alina and Thara pushed forward, breaking through the Tsar lines to reach the core. They planted charges along the power conduits, but time was running out. The Tsar forces were closing in, and it was only a matter of minutes before they were completely overrun. Charges are set, Elena called out. We need to get out of here. The sacrifice. As the team began their retreat, a massive Tsar warlord entered the chamber, blocking their exit. It was their leader, the one who had orchestrated the entire war. He was a towering figure, clad in advanced armor and wielding a weapon that crackled with energy. You have fought well, humans, the warlord growled, his voice echoing through the chamber. But this is the end. Your alliance is broken, and soon your worlds will burn. Elena gripped her weapon tighter, her heart racing. They couldn't defeat him in direct combat, not with the limited firepower they had left, but they didn't need to. The charges were set, and all they had to do was make it to the extraction point. But as the team moved to escape, Thara stopped. She looked at Elena, a determined expression on her face. I'll hold him off, she said quietly. Elena's eyes widened. No, we can still make it. We can. Thara shook her head. This is the only way. You need to get the rest of the team out of here. I'll buy you time. Before Elena could protest, Thara charged at the warlord, her weapon blazing. The two clashed in a furious melee, their battle shaking the chamber. Elena's heart sank, but she knew Thara was right. Without her sacrifice, they would all die here. With a heavy heart, she led the rest of the team to the extraction point. The end of the Tsar. As the shuttle pulled away from the asteroid, the charges detonated. The core exploded, sending a shockwave through the installation. The Tsar's superweapon was destroyed, and with it, their final hope for victory. Back aboard the Nemesis, Elena stood in the observation deck, watching as the asteroid crumbled into nothingness. The war was over, but at a terrible cost. Thara was gone, and the alliance between humanity and the Wrath would never be the same. But for now, they had won. The Tsar threat had been eliminated, and the galaxy had been saved. Epilogue: a fragile peace. In the aftermath of the final battle, both humanity and the Wrath returned to their worlds to rebuild. The scars of the war would take generations to heal, but there was hope. Elena stood before a memorial, dedicated to those who had fallen in the war. Among the names was Thara's, a reminder of the sacrifice she had made to ensure their survival. The alliance between humanity and the Wrath was fragile, but it had endured. For now, peace had been restored. But Elena knew that the galaxy was a dangerous place, and new threats would always emerge. As she turned to leave the memorial, she felt a sense of resolve. Whatever the future held, humanity would be ready.